I was setting the dining room table for Sunday dinner when I heard Daniel's voice drift through the partially open window. He was in the garden with his mother, their conversation carrying clearly in the evening air. "Mom, you need to stop pressuring Rebecca about grandchildren," he said, his tone tinged with annoyance. I froze, wineglass in hand, suddenly alert. "She's working so hard to fit into our world, it's exhausting her." His mother, Vivian, made a dismissive sound that I'd become all too familiar with over our 4 years of marriage. "Darling, if you'd chosen someone from our circle, you wouldn't have these problems," she replied. "I still don't understand why you married someone so unsuitable." I held my breath, waiting for my husband to defend me. Instead, his response shattered my world. Rebecca was exactly what I needed at that point in my career. Authentic, hardworking background, the perfect image for launching an innovative startup with values, he explained, his voice clinical and detached. "She's a temporary wife, Mom. Once Horizon goes public next year, I'll have outgrown the need for her particular aesthetic. The prenup ensures a clean break. Just be patient." The wineglass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Their conversation abruptly stopped at the sound. As I knelt to collect the glittering shards, cutting my finger in the process, a strange calm washed over me. 4 years of trying to win over his family, of supporting his company, of believing we were building a life together. All of it had been a calculated business strategy. Blood dripped onto the pristine floor as I realized my entire marriage had been nothing but a temporary arrangement, one that I hadn't been informed about. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I met Daniel Mitchell 6 years ago at a sustainable technology conference in Portland. I was there representing the nonprofit environmental education organization where I worked, while he was seeking partnerships for his fledgling green energy startup, Horizon Innovations. With my environmental science degree from a state university and passion for sustainability, I was immediately drawn to his vision of creating affordable clean energy solutions for underserved communities. Daniel seemed equally captivated by me. "You're not like anyone else in this industry," he told me on our 3rd date, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Everyone's so focused on appearances and connections. You actually care about the mission." Looking back now, I should have recognized that comment for what it was. Not a compliment, but an assessment of my utility. We married after a whirlwind 18-month courtship. I resigned from my beloved nonprofit position to help build Horizon, working alongside Daniel to secure initial investors, craft the company's ethical mission statement, and connect with community organizations. My background and genuine passion for environmental justice lent credibility to Horizon's claims of being different from typical profit-driven startups. Investors responded enthusiastically to our story, the brilliant Harvard MBA who fell in love with a passionate environmentalist, combining innovation with authentic purpose. What I didn't realize was that I was merely a character in a narrative Daniel had carefully constructed. When his mother, Vivian, first met me, her disapproval was immediate but subtle. "How interesting that you attended a state school," she remarked during our first dinner together. "I suppose that gives you a unique perspective on the real world." Over the years, her backhanded comments about my clothes, my mannerisms, and my lack of proper connections had become a constant undercurrent in our lives. Daniel always soothed me afterward, assuring me that his mother would eventually come around, that I just needed to give her time. Now I understood why that time would never come. I wasn't meant to be permanent. As I cleaned up the broken glass from the dining room floor, I heard the patio door slide open. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned yet wary. "Everything okay in here? We heard something break," he said, eyes darting to my bleeding finger. "Just a little accident," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the hurricane raging inside me. "Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes. Vivian appeared behind him, her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer outfit, making me acutely aware of my simple dress and bare feet. "Perhaps you should invest in a housekeeper, Daniel," she suggested. "Rebecca clearly has enough on her plate." Daniel gave his mother a tight smile. "Why don't you go relax in the living room, Mom? I'll help Becky finish up." As Vivian departed with a disapproving sniff, Daniel knelt beside me to help with the glass shards. I watched his hands, the same hands that had held mine at the altar, promising forever, and fought to keep my face neutral. "Did you cut yourself?" he asked, noticing the blood. "It's nothing serious," I answered, standing to dispose of the glass. "Just a reminder to be more careful about fragile things." He kissed my forehead absently, completely unaware that I had overheard everything. In that moment, I made a decision. If I was just a business strategy, then I would become the most catastrophic miscalculation of Daniel Mitchell's career. I finished preparing dinner with mechanical precision, serving the meal with a smile that never reached my eyes. Throughout the evening, I observed Daniel with new awareness, noting how he showcased my environmental knowledge when it served his purpose, how he subtly guided the conversation to highlight his own accomplishments, how he used my presence as some kind of proof of his company's authentic values. Rebecca was the one who suggested we partner with community colleges for our internship program, he told his mother, placing his hand over mine. That kind of thinking outside the box is what makes Horizon different. Vivian's smile was thin. Yes, very unconventional. After dinner, as Daniel walked his mother to her car, I slipped into his home office. With trembling hands, I opened his laptop. As the co-founder officially listed on Horizon's corporate documents, I had access to most company files, though Daniel had increasingly limited my involvement as the company grew. Within minutes, I had forwarded several key documents to my personal email: the shareholder agreement, the upcoming IPO preparation materials, and most importantly, our prenuptial agreement. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. When Daniel returned, I was curled up on the couch with a book, the perfect picture of an unsuspecting wife. Mother was in rare form tonight, he sighed, loosening his tie as he sat beside me. Sorry about that. No need to apologize, I said, turning a page. I understand her position better than you might think. He raised an eyebrow at my tone, but seemed too tired to pursue it. Big week coming up. The venture capital presentation on Wednesday could take us to the next level. I nodded, thinking of the files now sitting in my email inbox. I'm sure you'll get exactly what you deserve. Daniel. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake planning my next steps. The prenup I had reviewed was even more restrictive than I remembered. I would walk away with virtually nothing if we divorced before the 5-year mark, which we would reach in approximately 10 months. Daniel had timed everything perfectly. The company would go public. He would divorce his temporary wife, and he would emerge as an eligible bachelor with a successful company and minimal financial obligation to the woman who had helped build it. Unless I changed the narrative entirely. The next morning, I called in sick to Horizon for the first time since we'd founded the company. Instead of going to the office, I drove to Bridgetown Brew, a coffee shop across town where I was unlikely to run into anyone connected to Daniel. I opened my laptop and began methodically reviewing everything I had gathered. Horizon Innovations had grown from a promising startup to a company valued at over $200 million in just a few years. Our sustainable energy storage solutions were revolutionizing how small communities accessed clean energy. On paper, we were the model of ethical business: transparent operations, diverse hiring practices, community-focused projects. But as I dug deeper into the financial documents, I began to notice discrepancies. Certain investor funds had been allocated to R&D projects that showed no actual progress. Community initiative budgets had been approved but only partially deployed, with the remaining funds diverted to vague administrative costs. Most concerning, the primary technology patent, the cornerstone of Horizon's value, had been registered not to the company, but to a separate entity called Mitchell Innovations, which I had never heard of. My hands shook as I realized the extent of Daniel's deception. He hadn't just planned to discard me as his wife. He had systematically positioned himself to maintain control of the company's most valuable assets while limiting my claim to its success, despite my role as co-founder. I needed help understanding the legal implications of what I was finding. I scrolled through my contacts, hesitating over names of mutual friends and colleagues who might alert Daniel to my inquiries. Finally, I called Olivia Jenkins, my college roommate who now worked as a corporate attorney at a firm unconnected to Horizon. "Becky, this is a surprise," Olivia answered. "Everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted, my voice finally breaking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need your help, but it has to stay completely confidential. 2 hours later, Olivia sat across from me at the coffee shop, her expression grave as she reviewed the documents. "This is troubling," she said finally, keeping her voice low. "The separate patent ownership alone is a serious issue, especially if company resources were used to develop the technology. And these financial allocations raise red flags for potential investor fraud." "What options do I have?" I asked, clutching my now cold coffee. Olivia tapped her pen against her legal pad. "As a co-founder and current employee, you have certain rights and obligations. If you've discovered potential misconduct, you could report it internally or to regulatory authorities. And if I do that, Daniel would likely try to discredit you, minimize your role, possibly even attempt to remove you from the company before you can cause any damage." She hesitated. "There's also the personal aspect. Are you sure you want to take this route? It would mean the end of your marriage." I laughed hollowly. "My marriage ended yesterday when I learned I was a temporary wife chosen for my useful background and scheduled for replacement after the IPO." Olivia's eyes widened, then narrowed with anger on my behalf. "In that case," she said, flipping to a fresh page in her notebook, "let's discuss strategy. You need to be extremely careful about your next steps." Over the following weeks, I executed a careful plan. On the surface, I remained the supportive co-founder wife, attending company functions, contributing to meetings when asked, and maintaining a normal relationship with Daniel at home. He noticed nothing amiss, too absorbed in the upcoming venture, capital presentation, and IPO preparations to register my subtle withdrawal. Meanwhile, I worked methodically to secure my position. First, I recovered earlier versions of key company documents that proved my substantial contributions to Horizon's core technology, preserving them with Olivia's help. Then, I reached out to several of our community partners under the guise of preparing impact reports, gathering testimonials about my involvement in establishing these crucial relationships. Most importantly, I scheduled discreet meetings with Jason Reynolds, Daniel's business partner and Horizon's CFO. Jason had always treated me with genuine respect, and I suspected he might be unaware of Daniel's financial maneuvering. "These numbers don't match what we presented to the board last quarter," Jason said during our third private meeting, frowning at the spreadsheet I'd prepared comparing official reports with actual deployments of funds. I noticed the discrepancies. While preparing the community impact assessment, I explained, maintaining my composure. "I thought you should see them before our next investor presentation." Jason looked troubled. "Daniel handles most of the financial reporting directly. I review the summaries, but not always the underlying allocations." He studied me carefully. "Why bring this to me privately, instead of raising it in our executive meeting?" I met his gaze steadily. "Because I believe in Horizon's mission, and I want to ensure we're truly living up to it." These discrepancies concern me, and I wanted your perspective before creating any unnecessary tension. Jason nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken dynamics. I'll look into this discreetly. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Rebecca. 2 days before the major venture capital presentation that could secure Horizon's final pre-IPO funding round, I made my final preparations. I had compiled a comprehensive file documenting the financial discrepancies, the improperly registered patent, and Daniel's systematic efforts to limit my role despite my status as co-founder. I had gathered statements from employees and partners, attesting to my contributions. And I had enlisted both Olivia and Jason's support, though Jason still hoped the situation could be resolved without public disclosure. That evening, Daniel was unusually attentive at dinner, opening an expensive bottle of wine and proposing a toast. "To Horizon's future," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "After Wednesday's presentation, everything changes. We'll be on the fast track to the IPO." "Everything changes," I echoed, sipping my wine. "You must be excited." "We've worked hard for this," he replied, reaching for my hand across the table. "I couldn't have done it without you, you know." For a moment, doubt crept in. Had I misunderstood? Had I imagined the conversation with his mother? But then I remembered his cold, calculating voice. "She's a temporary wife, Mom. Once Horizon goes public next year, I'll have outgrown the need for her particular aesthetic." I squeezed his hand and smiled. "I know." The venture capital presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Evergreen Hotel's Grand Ballroom. All major investors would be present, along with potential new backers who could provide the final $50 million in funding before Horizon went public. The company's entire executive team would attend, as would select board members and key partners. I arrived early, dressed in a professional navy suit that subtly contrasted with the casual tech attire Daniel had always encouraged me to wear at company functions, part of the authentic, approachable image he had cultivated for us. My hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, my makeup understated but flawless. I looked like what I was, a serious business executive who demanded respect. Daniel did a double take when he saw me in the preparation room. "You look different," he said, adjusting his presentation notes. "I thought the occasion called for something more polished," I replied. "After all, today changes everything." He nodded, distracted by last-minute preparations. "The investment team from Apex Capital is already here. Their backing would be a game changer." "I spoke with them briefly in the lobby," I said casually. "They seemed particularly interested in our community impact metrics." I offered to address any questions they might have during the Q&A. Daniel frowned slightly. "Let's stick to the plan, Rebecca. I'll handle the financial projections and technology overview. Jason will cover operations. You can address the community. Partnerships if questions arise. But we need to stay focused on what these investors care about: return on investment." "Of course," I agreed mildly. "We all want this presentation to reveal exactly what Horizon is truly about." As investors and board members filed into the ballroom, I spotted Vivian Mitchell taking a seat in the front row. Daniel had invited his mother to witness his triumph, unaware that her presence would make what was about to happen even more satisfying. The presentation began with Daniel's trademark charismatic introduction, outlining Horizon's journey from scrappy startup to industry innovator. He wove our personal story into the company narrative as he always did, describing how meeting me had inspired him to focus on technology with real-world impact. Authentic vision, combined with rigorous business strategy, that's the Horizon difference, he declared, gesturing to the impressive growth charts projected behind him. Jason followed with an overview of operations and current projects, his presentation typically polished, but his eyes occasionally flicking toward me with poorly concealed concern. He knew what I had discovered. but not what I plan to do about it. When the formal presentation concluded and the Q&A began, the lead investor from Apex Capital raised his hand first. "Impressive numbers," he acknowledged. "But recent reports suggest some discrepancies between announced community project investments and actual deployments. Can you address that?" Daniel's smile never faltered, though I noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "I'm not aware of any discrepancies. All our financial reporting is thoroughly vetted. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding about project timelines." "Actually," I said, standing and moving toward the podium before Daniel could continue, "I can address this directly as the executive overseeing our community partnerships." Daniel shot me a warning look, but in a room full of investors, he couldn't stop me without creating an awkward scene. "There have indeed been some inconsistencies in how community project funds have been allocated," I continued, my voice calm and authoritative. "In preparation for today, I compiled a complete analysis. I connected my laptop to the presentation system, replacing Daniel's carefully crafted slides with my documented evidence of financial discrepancies." The room fell silent as investors leaned forward, studying the numbers with growing concern. "Additionally," I continued, "I recently discovered that Horizon's core technology patent was registered not to the company, but to a separate entity controlled solely by Daniel Mitchell, despite being developed with company resources and team effort." Daniel's face drained of color. "Rebecca, this is hardly the appropriate forum." "I disagree," I interrupted smoothly. "Our potential investors deserve complete transparency, don't they? Isn't that what Horizon claims to value?" The lead investor from Apex Capital frowned. "Is this accurate, Mr. Mitchell? Is the primary patent registered to a separate entity?" Daniel attempted recovery, his voice tight. "There were complex legal considerations involved in the initial patent filing. I'd be happy to discuss the arrangement privately." "The arrangement," I interjected, "would allow Daniel to maintain control of Horizon's most valuable asset regardless of company ownership changes following the IPO. It also significantly impacts the actual valuation being presented today." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Board members exchanged alarmed glances. In the front row, Vivian Mitchell sat rigid with fury, her eyes boring into me with undisguised hatred. Jason stepped forward, his expression grim but determined. "As CFO, I can confirm that I've recently become aware of these issues and have begun an internal investigation. The discrepancies appear to be substantial." Daniel lunged for the microphone. "This is a misunderstanding, a disagreement between my wife and me that she's inappropriately bringing into a business context." I smiled coolly. "This has nothing to do with our marriage, Daniel. Though speaking of inappropriate mixing of personal and business matters, perhaps you'd like to explain to our investors why you referred to me as your temporary wife chosen for my useful background in building Horizon's image, with plans to discard me after the IPO?" The shocked silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at me, his careful facade finally crumbling to reveal the calculating man beneath. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "You're destroying everything." "No, Daniel," I replied calmly. "I'm simply ensuring transparency, something you've always claimed to value." Turning back to the stunned audience, I continued. "As co-founder and a significant shareholder in Horizon Innovations, I cannot in good conscience allow investment decisions to be made without full disclosure of these issues. I've prepared detailed documentation for the board and relevant regulatory authorities." The presentation dissolved into chaos after that. Investors demanded immediate answers. Board members called for an emergency session. Jason stepped in to announce that the presentation would be suspended pending a full investigation, professionally managing the crisis as Daniel stood frozen with rage and disbelief. In the aftermath, as people began filing out of the ballroom, Vivian Mitchell approached me, vibrating with anger. "You ungrateful little nobody," she spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I met her gaze calmly. "I believe the word you're looking for is temporary, Vivian, as in temporary setback for your son, though I suspect his problems may prove rather permanent." I walked away without waiting for her response, my head held high. For the first time since overhearing that garden conversation, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. The future was uncertain. Horizon would likely undergo a complete restructuring. The IPO would be delayed if not canceled, and my marriage was unquestionably over. But as I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunshine, I realized that Daniel had been right about one thing. Everything had changed today, just not in the way he had planned. The Evergreen Hotel lobby buzzed with frantic activity in the wake of my presentation. Board members huddled in corners, investors spoke urgently into phones, and security discreetly positioned themselves near the exits. I moved through the chaos with deliberate calm, nodding politely to those who caught my eye but offering no further explanation beyond what I'd already revealed. My phone vibrated continuously with messages and calls, most from Daniel, which I ignored. Olivia had advised me to say nothing further without legal representation present. The damage was done. Now it was time to protect myself from the inevitable backlash. In the ladies' room, I took a moment to collect myself, studying my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared remarkably composed, despite having just detonated her marriage and possibly her career. My hands trembled slightly as I reapplied my lipstick, the only visible sign of the emotional hurricane within. The door swung open, and Tara Wilson, Daniel's executive assistant, stepped inside. Her eyes widened at the sight of me. "Rebecca," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Daniel's looking everywhere for you. She hesitated. "Not in a good state." I capped my lipstick. "I imagine not." Tara glanced nervously at the door. "He's instructed security to escort you from the building if they find you. Claims you're having a mental breakdown." I almost laughed at the predictability of his response. "Of course he has." "The thing is," Tara continued, fidgeting with her lanyard, "some of what you said in there about the community project funds. I've seen the original allocations. The numbers never added up in the final reports." I studied her carefully. Tara had been with Horizon almost from the beginning, initially hired as my assistant before Daniel gradually shifted her responsibilities until she reported directly to him. "You knew?" She shook her head quickly. "Not everything. Not about the patent. But I process all the paperwork, and sometimes things wouldn't match from one day to the next. Daniel would tell me it was reclassification for tax purposes or investor communications." A restroom attendant entered, and our conversation paused as she checked towel supplies. When she left, Tara stepped closer. "I've downloaded copies of the original documents, the ones before modifications," she whispered. "If you need them." The door burst open again, and Mark Henderson, Horizon's legal counsel, entered with a security guard behind him. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said stiffly, "I need to speak with you immediately." I nodded to Tara, who slipped out with a meaningful glance. "Mr. Henderson," I replied, gathering my purse. "I was just leaving." "That would be inadvisable," he stated, blocking my path. "The board has called an emergency session. Your presence is required." So it was beginning already. The attempt to contain the damage, to silence me, perhaps to force a retraction that would make me appear unstable or vindictive. "I'll be happy to attend with my attorney present," I replied. "She should arrive within the hour." Mark's expression tightened. "This is an internal corporate matter. Outside counsel isn't necessary or appropriate at this stage." "I disagree," I said pleasantly. "Given that I've just publicly disclosed potential securities, fraud and patent irregularities, I believe legal representation is not just appropriate but essential." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Rebecca, be reasonable. We can resolve this privately. A public legal battle benefits no one. Not the company, not the employees whose jobs depend on that investment round, and certainly not you." Before I could respond, Jason appeared in the doorway. "Rebecca, there you are. The investors from Apex want to speak with you directly." He nodded curtly to Mark. "Alone." Mark's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside. As I followed Jason down the corridor, he murmured, "Daniel's trying to spin this as a personal vendetta from a bitter wife. We need to get you somewhere secure before he does something we'll all regret." We slipped through a service entrance and out to the hotel's side parking lot where Olivia was waiting in her car. She reached across to push open the passenger door. "Get in," she urged. "We need to move quickly." As we pulled away from the hotel, I glimpsed Daniel bursting through the main entrance, scanning the driveway frantically. Our eyes met for just a moment before Olivia accelerated onto the main road, and the look of utter betrayal on his face almost made me laugh. How dare he, the architect of my planned disposal, feel betrayed by my self-preservation? "The Apex investors want to meet privately," Jason explained from the back seat. "They're sending their legal team to my place in an hour. They believe your claims have merit and want to understand the full scope before making any decisions." Olivia navigated through downtown Portland traffic with practiced ease. "What's happening with the board?" "Split," Jason replied. 3 members want to place Rebecca on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. 2 are calling for Daniel's suspension instead. The remaining 2 are fence-sitting, waiting to see which way the wind blows. "And you?" I asked, turning to face him. "What's your position?" Jason met my gaze directly. "I'm the CFO who failed to catch financial misrepresentations. My position is precarious regardless of whose side I take." He sighed heavily. "But I've shared everything I've verified independently with the board. The numbers don't lie, even if I was too trusting to see it sooner." At Olivia's condo in the Pearl District, we huddled around her dining table, preparing for the meeting with Apex's team. My phone continued its relentless vibration until I finally silenced it completely. 57 missed calls from Daniel, I noted, scanning the notifications. Plus 8 voicemails and 32 text messages ranging from apologetic to threatening. Olivia took my phone, placing it face down on the counter. "Don't engage. Anything you say can be used against you, particularly if he's recording." "What exactly is your endgame here, Rebecca?" Jason asked, loosening his tie as he reviewed the financial documents spread before us. "Full disclosure to authorities? Settlement? Negotiated exit from both the marriage and company?" I considered the question carefully. In the immediate aftermath of discovering Daniel's betrayal, revenge had been my driving motivation, the desire to hurt him as deeply as he had hurt me. But as I dug deeper into Horizon's operations, my focus had shifted. This wasn't just about punishing Daniel. It was about protecting what we'd built together, what I had sacrificed for, what I truly believed in despite his cynical exploitation of my ideals. "I want Horizon to fulfill its original mission," I said finally. "The company was founded to create meaningful change in how communities access sustainable energy. That purpose is still valid, even if Daniel's commitment to it was a facade." Jason nodded slowly. "And Daniel?" "I want him held accountable," I replied without hesitation. "Not just for planning to discard me when I was no longer useful, but for corrupting the company's mission and defrauding investors who believed in that mission." The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Apex's representatives. What followed was 3 hours of meticulous questioning, document review, and negotiation. The investment firm's interest was primarily self-protective. They needed to understand their exposure if they proceeded with funding Horizon given these revelations. "Mrs. Mitchell," their lead counsel began, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s. What assurances can you provide that these disclosures aren't motivated by personal animus toward your husband? I pushed the folder containing my evidence across the table. The financial discrepancies exist independently of my feelings toward Daniel. The patent registration to Mitchell Innovations rather than Horizon is a verifiable fact. My motivation for disclosing now rather than later may have been influenced by personal factors, but the underlying issues are real and substantiated. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my candor. And what outcome are you seeking from Apex? Specifically? I believe in Horizon's potential and purpose, I replied. I'm seeking transparency and appropriate governance to ensure the company fulfills its mission. Daniel Mitchell's leadership has compromised that mission. I want Apex's investment to support Horizon's stated goals, not Daniel's personal enrichment. As midnight approached, we reached a tentative agreement. Apex would not withdraw entirely, but would place their investment in escrow, pending a thorough independent audit and significant governance changes. They would support my continued role in the company while requiring Daniel's suspension during the investigation. After they departed, I sank onto Olivia's couch, exhaustion finally claiming me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day ebbed away, leaving me hollow and uncertain. You should get some rest, Olivia advised, handing me a blanket. Tomorrow will be just as challenging. Daniel won't surrender control without a fight. She was right. Dawn brought news that Daniel had called an emergency staff meeting at Horizon, framing the previous day's events as an unfortunate family dispute that had inappropriately spilled into company business. He assured employees that operations would continue normally and characterized my actions as emotionally driven and regrettably damaging to our collective work. I learned this from Tara, who texted me the contents of Daniel's company-wide email along with, "He's locked down. All systems. Changed access codes to the building. Security has your photo at reception with instructions to deny entry." I forwarded the message to Olivia, who was already on the phone with the court clerk filing for an emergency injunction to prevent Daniel from making further material changes to company operations while under investigation. By noon, the situation had escalated further. Daniel had attempted to call an impromptu board vote to remove me from my position as co-founder, only to be blocked by the 3 members who demanded a proper investigation first. In retaliation, he'd instructed the IT department to restrict access to all company systems for anyone associated with my faction, including Jason. When my personal bank account suddenly showed 0 balances, the next phase of his counterattack became clear. "He's activated the prenup's infidelity clause," Olivia explained after speaking with my bank. "He's claiming your actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty equivalent to infidelity under the terms of your agreement, which allows him to freeze jointly held assets." I stared at my bank app in disbelief. Can he do that? Temporarily, yes, we'll contest it, but he's making a point. He can cut you off completely. For the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of doubt. Daniel controlled our finances, our home, the company we'd built together. He had resources and connections I couldn't match. Had I underestimated what he was willing to do to maintain control? My phone rang with an unknown number. Against Olivia's advice, I answered, "Rebecca." It was Vivian Mitchell's crisp voice. "I think it's time we spoke directly." I put the call on speaker so Olivia could hear. "I have nothing to say to you, Vivian." "Perhaps not, but you might wish to listen. I'm at your house." "What was your house?" "Daniel has removed your belongings. They're being placed in storage as we speak." My stomach dropped. Our home, the Craftsman in Lake Oswego that we'd renovated together, where I'd planted a garden and built a life, was being systematically emptied of my existence. "That's illegal," Olivia interjected. "We'll file for—" "Oh, hello to Daniels." "Lawyer as well," Vivian interrupted smoothly. "How efficient. Now you can both hear my proposition." Rebecca, this vendetta has gone far enough. You've made your point. Daniel is prepared to offer a generous settlement, $2 million and a clean departure. No further investigation, no public accusations, no messy legal battle. You walk away wealthy and unencumbered. The amount was substantial, far more than I would receive under the prenup if we divorced before our 5th anniversary. It was meant to be tempting, a path of least resistance that would leave me financially secure while allowing Daniel to maintain control of Horizon and shape the narrative of our separation. And if I decline? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then Daniel will contest everything, Vivian replied coldly. Every claim you've made, every document you've produced, every allegation of impropriety. He'll ensure this drags through courts for years, draining whatever resources you have left. Your reputation will be destroyed. The bitter, unstable wife who tried to sabotage her husband's success out of jealousy. As Vivian spoke, I received an email from Jason containing scans of the documents Tara had promised. The original, unaltered financial records showing clear evidence of Daniel's systematic misappropriation. They were more damning than even I had realized, revealing a pattern of deception dating back almost to Horizon's founding. Additionally, Vivian continued, unaware of this development, Daniel has prepared a counter-narrative regarding the patent registration. He has documentation showing you agreed to the separate entity structure during initial company formation. You signed the papers yourself. This was true, though misleading. I had signed numerous documents during Horizon's chaotic early days, trusting Daniel to handle the legal aspects while I focused on community partnerships and technology implementation. My signature likely appeared on papers whose implications I hadn't fully understood, a fact Daniel would certainly exploit. Your silence and resignation by end of business today or the offer expires, Vivian concluded. Daniel is prepared to announce your departure as an amicable separation due to personal differences about the company's future direction. You'll be painted as the idealist who couldn't adapt to business realities. Unflattering, perhaps, but far better than the alternative. After she hung up, Olivia looked at me gravely. $2 million is significant. The legal battle ahead will be brutal, Rebecca. Daniel will use every resource at his disposal. I stared at the documents Jason had sent, particularly a spreadsheet showing over $30 million moved through the Mitchell Innovations entity. Money that should have funded the community projects that had drawn me to this work in the first place. Schedule a meeting with the SEC, I said quietly, and contact the board members who were wavering. They need to see these records before they make any decisions. Olivia studied me carefully. You understand what this means? Once we involve federal regulators, there's no settlement, no quiet resolution. This becomes a matter of public record, possibly criminal charges. I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. Daniel was right about one thing. I am an idealist. I actually believed in what Horizon claimed to stand for, sustainable technology that served communities, not just shareholders. If I take that money and walk away, everything I've worked for becomes nothing but a marketing slogan in service to his ambition. By late afternoon, events accelerated beyond anyone's control. An anonymous source, almost certainly Tara, leaked documents to the Portland Business Journal detailing both the financial discrepancies and Daniel's temporary wife statement. The story spread rapidly through industry publications and local news outlets, forcing the board to take more decisive action. Daniel was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, though he retained his ownership stake. The board appointed an interim management committee including Jason and 2 senior directors to stabilize operations. Most significantly, they publicly acknowledged the serious nature of the allegations and committed to a thorough, independent review. I watched these developments unfold from Olivia's condo, feeling oddly detached from the corporate drama, despite being its catalyst. My phone rang again. this time showing Daniel's number directly. Against all better judgment, I answered. "You've destroyed everything," he said without preamble, his voice raw with emotion I'd rarely heard from him. "Are you satisfied now?" "I didn't destroy anything, Daniel. You did that when you decided I was expendable." He laughed bitterly. "That conversation with my mother, you took it completely out of context. I was trying to get her off my back about grandchildren, about why we were waiting to start a family. By telling her I was temporary? That once the IPO happened, you'd have outgrown the need for my particular aesthetic?" I quoted his words precisely, their sharp edges still cutting through me. A long pause followed. "I shouldn't have said that," he finally admitted. "It was cruel and untrue. But to use one bad moment, one thoughtless comment to justify what you've done—" "This isn't about that comment," I interrupted. "It's about the $30 million diverted from community projects. It's about the patent you registered to your personal entity instead of Horizon. It's about years of systematic deception that happened to include your plan to discard me when I was no longer useful." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its calculating edge. "You won't win this, Rebecca. I built Horizon from nothing. The investors, the board, the industry, they know me. They respect me. You're just the idealistic wife who couldn't understand how business works." "We built Horizon," I corrected, "and I understand perfectly how business should work, with integrity, with accountability, with actual commitment to the values we claim to represent." "Such nobility," he sneered. "Let's see how long your principles last when you're facing financial ruin and public humiliation. I know things about you that would make compelling counter-narratives. How you struggled with anxiety during our first investor roadshow. How you overcommitted to those neighborhood installations that nearly bankrupted us early on. How your environmental standards were sometimes conveniently flexible when we needed to close a deal." The threat was clear. He would twist every vulnerability, every compromise, every human imperfection into ammunition against me. The Daniel I thought I'd married had never existed. This cold, tactical opponent had always been the real man, behind the mask. "I'll take my chances," I replied, ending the call before he could respond. That evening, as Olivia worked on our legal strategy, I sat by her window overlooking the city lights of Portland. Somewhere out there was the house I could no longer enter, filled with possessions I might never reclaim. The company I had helped build was in turmoil. My marriage was irrevocably shattered. By any rational measure, I had lost everything. Yet, I felt strangely unburdened. The careful facade I'd maintained throughout my marriage, always striving to be good enough for Daniel, for his mother, for the world they inhabited, had crumbled away. What remained was simply me, Rebecca Carter, not Rebecca Mitchell, a woman who had built something valuable once and could do so again, this time without compromise. My phone lit up with a text from Jason. "Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. They want you there. Apex still in with conditions. This isn't over." I watched Portland's lights shimmer through a gentle rain, thinking of all the communities that would benefit from Horizon's technology if the company stayed true to its original mission. Whatever happened next, whether I remained with Horizon or started fresh elsewhere, I would no longer be anyone's temporary anything. The woman who had stood in her dining room holding broken glass just days ago was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, and permanent. I arrived at Horizon, headquarters the next morning, flanked by Olivia and a silver-haired forensic accountant she had engaged overnight. The security guard at reception looked uncomfortable as he checked his instructions, clearly torn between Daniel's directive to bar my entry and the board's more recent order to admit me to the 9th floor conference room. "Mrs. Mitchell," he finally acknowledged, printing a visitor badge that struck me as deeply ironic. After co-founding the company and working here for years, I was now classified as a visitor. "You'll need to be escorted at all times." A security escort materialized to guide us through the familiar corridors, where employees watched our procession with poorly concealed fascination. Their whispered conversations halted as we passed, resuming in urgent murmurs behind us. I maintained a dignified expression despite the humiliation of being treated like an intruder in the space I had helped create. The conference room contained an almost perfect tableau of corporate crisis. 7 board members sat arrayed along one side of the massive oak table, their expressions ranging from openly hostile to cautiously neutral. Jason occupied a seat near the center, his posture rigid with tension. Mark Henderson, the company counsel, sat at one end reviewing documents with 2 junior attorneys. At the far end, a video conference screen displayed 3 faces I recognized as representatives from Apex Capital. Conspicuously absent was Daniel himself. "Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Mitchell," began Eleanor Winters, the board chair, a silver-haired venture capitalist who had been one of Horizon's earliest investors. "Before we begin, I want to clarify that this meeting is being recorded, and anything said may be used in subsequent legal proceedings." I nodded my understanding as Olivia placed a small recording device of her own on the table, a clear signal that we were equally prepared to document the proceedings. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Eleanor continued. "The allegations you made publicly have created a crisis situation for Horizon. The board has temporarily suspended Daniel Mitchell pending investigation, but we remain deeply concerned about the manner in which these issues were raised." "With respect, Ms. Winters," Olivia interjected smoothly, "my client attempted to address these concerns through proper channels before the public disclosure became necessary." Mark Henderson shook his head. "There is no record of Mrs. Mitchell raising these issues with the audit committee or legal department. The first anyone heard of these allegations was during a presentation to potential investors, arguably the most damaging possible venue." I leaned forward. I approached Jason Reynolds with my concerns regarding financial discrepancies. As CFO and a board member, he represents a proper channel. All eyes turned to Jason, who nodded reluctantly. "Rebecca did bring certain inconsistencies to my attention approximately 2 weeks ago. I was in the process of reviewing them when the investor presentation occurred." "A mere 2 weeks," scoffed Harold Parker, a board member closely aligned with Daniel. "Hardly sufficient time for proper investigation before making such explosive public accusations." The forensic accountant Olivia had brought cleared his throat. "If I may, a preliminary review of the documentation suggests these discrepancies were neither minor nor recent. The pattern of fund diversion appears systematic and extends back approximately 3 years. Given the scale and duration, 2 weeks would be more than adequate for initial verification." Eleanor tapped her pen against the table, her shrewd eyes assessing me. "Let's be candid, Mrs. Mitchell. There's considerable concern that your actions were motivated by personal grievances rather than corporate governance concerns. The moment had come to address the personal element directly. I had debated extensively with Olivia about how to handle this, whether to maintain a strictly professional approach or acknowledge the personal catalyst for my investigation. "I won't deny that personal factors influenced the timing of my discovery," I stated carefully. "I overheard a conversation in which my husband described me as a temporary wife who would be discarded after the company's IPO. This naturally led me to question other aspects of our relationship, including our business partnership." "Harold." Parker snorted derisively. "So you admit this is a vindictive response to marital problems?" "No," I replied firmly. "I'm explaining how I came to scrutinize financial records I had previously trusted my husband to manage appropriately. What I found: millions diverted from community projects, patent ownership secretly transferred to a separate entity. These are substantive issues independent of any personal grievances." One of the Apex representatives spoke up from the video screen. Our primary concern is whether Horizon's core technology and financial position are accurately represented. The marital situation, while regrettable, is secondary to the question of corporate governance and accurate disclosure to investors. Eleanor nodded. Precisely. Which brings us to the central question: what resolution does Mrs. Mitchell seek here? Is your goal to remain with the company? To force Daniel's permanent removal? Financial settlement? We need to understand your endgame. It was the same question Jason had asked earlier. What did I truly want from this confrontation? The answer had crystallized overnight as I'd reflected on my years with Horizon. I want Horizon to fulfill its founding mission, I said simply. I've invested 4 years of my life in building a company that promised to deliver sustainable energy solutions to communities that need them most. The diverted funds were intended for projects that would have made meaningful differences in people's lives. I placed my hand on a folder containing project proposals for low-income neighborhood installations. These communities were promised technology that would reduce their energy costs by up to 60%. Those promises were made in Horizon's name. My name. I want them kept. The room fell silent as my words hung in the air. Even Harold Parker seemed momentarily at a loss for a dismissive response. Noble sentiments, Eleanor finally said, her tone less confrontational. But practically speaking, what governance structure do you envision that could move the company forward given the current circumstances? Before I could answer, the conference room door opened and Daniel strode in, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that contrasted sharply with his haggard expression. Dark circles underscored his eyes, and a tightness around his mouth suggested he was operating on little sleep and considerable stress. I apologize for my tardiness, he announced, ignoring the startled reactions from several board members. My legal counsel advised against attending, but I believe direct communication is essential at this juncture. Eleanor recovered first. Daniel, the board specifically requested you not attend this meeting to avoid potentially compromising discussions. I understand, he replied, remaining standing. But as founder and CEO, suspended or not, I have both the right and responsibility to address these allegations directly. His confidence was remarkable given the circumstances. Still, every inch the commanding executive, despite the evidence mounted against him, I felt a familiar pull, the almost gravitational force of his personality that had drawn me to him 6 years ago, and steeled myself against it. The board will decide whether your participation is appropriate, Eleanor stated firmly, glancing at Mark Henderson. The company counsel sighed. Legally, he does have the right to be present for any board discussion regarding his status, though it may complicate matters. Daniel took this as permission to continue, turning to face me directly, for the first time. Rebecca, I understand you're hurt and angry. What you overheard was inexcusable, a moment of weakness and frustration that in no way reflects my true feelings or intentions. Olivia placed a warning hand on my arm, but I shook it off gently. This confrontation was inevitable. And the financial discrepancies? I asked coolly. The diverted community funds? The patent registered to Mitchell Innovations instead of Horizon? Were those momentary weaknesses too? A muscle twitched in Daniel's jaw, a tell I'd come to recognize when he was formulating a strategic response. The financial structures of a rapidly scaling startup are complex. What may appear as discrepancies often reflect necessary flexibility in deploying capital for maximum impact. $30 million, Daniel, I said, my voice steady despite the anger churning beneath. $30 million meant for solar installations in communities that are still waiting for the technology we promised them. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. Those projects weren't abandoned, merely postponed until more efficient implementation was possible. The funds were temporarily reallocated to accelerate R&D that will ultimately benefit those same communities more substantially. The forensic accountant cleared his throat pointedly. The funds in question were transferred to an entity called Mitchell Innovations, then dispersed through a series of transactions that terminate in personal property purchases and offshore accounts. None appear to have been used for research and development activities. Daniel's expression hardened, the mask of reasonable explanation slipping momentarily before he recovered. That characterization is both simplistic and misleading. Financial structures. Stop, I interrupted. Just stop. Every person in this room has seen the documentation by now. The board, our investors, our partners, they all know what you did. Continuing to deny it only compounds the deception. He stared at me for a long moment, calculation evident in his eyes. Then, with a subtle shift in posture that I recognized from countless negotiations, he changed tactics. "You're right," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Mistakes were made. In my drive to build Horizon into something world-changing, I took shortcuts that I shouldn't have. I convinced myself the end justified the means." This apparent confession silenced the room. Several board members exchanged surprised glances, while Jason watched with narrow-eyed suspicion. "But, Rebecca," Daniel continued, moving around the table toward me, "you know better than anyone what we've built here. The potential Horizon has to transform energy access globally. Are you really willing to jeopardize that mission over financial irregularities that can be corrected? Over one thoughtless comment made during a moment of frustration?" I felt the weight of every gaze into the room, the collective assessment of whether this marital dispute would destroy a company poised for remarkable success. Daniel was masterfully reframing the narrative, no longer denying wrongdoing but casting it as minor compared to the greater good at stake. "The mission matters to me more than anyone," I replied carefully. "That's precisely why I couldn't remain silent when I discovered how it was being undermined. The communities we promised to serve deserve better than to be used as marketing while their allocated funds disappear into offshore accounts." Daniel sighed heavily, projecting sincere regret. "You're absolutely right. And I'm prepared to make amends, complete financial transparency, restructured governance, accelerated implementation of all community projects with enhanced funding. Whatever it takes to restore trust." Harold Parker nodded approvingly. "A reasonable approach. Mistakes occurred, but destroying the company helps no one. Proper remediation and improved oversight moving forward seem the sensible path." I noticed several board members warming to this compromise, their expressions softening as Daniel offered a way forward that wouldn't involve messy public disclosures or leadership upheaval. Even Eleanor seemed to be considering it. "If I may," Olivia interjected, "this generous spirit of remediation only emerged after the evidence became irrefutable. It's worth noting that my client has already filed preliminary documentation with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding these matters." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees at this revelation. Voluntary disclosure to the SEC took the situation beyond an internal corporate dispute into potential regulatory enforcement territory. Daniel's mask slipped completely, his expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "You went to the SEC? Without board authorization?" As co-founder with evidence of securities violations, she had both the right and obligation to report, Olivia stated firmly. "The filing is preliminary and could potentially be modified depending on remediation actions, but it was a necessary step given the seriousness of the issues uncovered." Mark Henderson looked ashen. "This changes the legal landscape considerably. Once the SEC is involved, our disclosure obligations become much more stringent." "Which was precisely my intention," I said, meeting Daniel's gaze steadily. "True transparency, not the carefully managed version Horizon has operated under." The facade of reconciliation vanished from Daniel's demeanor. "You've crossed a line, Rebecca, one you can't uncross." His voice was quiet but laced with unmistakable threat. "I believe we should adjourn to consider these developments," Eleanor announced, clearly recognizing the deteriorating situation. Mr. Mitchell, your presence is complicating an already difficult discussion. I must insist you leave while the board deliberates." For a moment, I thought Daniel might refuse. His body tensed with barely contained fury, his gaze never leaving. "Mine." Then with deliberate control, he straightened his jacket. "Before I go," he said, addressing the board rather than me, "consider this. Horizon's value lies primarily in its intellectual property, technology that I developed and that remains legally registered to Mitchell Innovations, despite any claims to the contrary. Without those patents, what exactly does Horizon possess that justifies its current valuation?" The implied threat was unmistakable. He would burn everything down rather than surrender control. After he left, the room remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Eleanor spoke. That was illuminating, if not particularly encouraging. She turned to me. "Mrs. Mitchell, given what we've just witnessed, I reiterate my earlier question. What resolution do you seek?" I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. "I seek 3 things. First, complete remediation of the diverted community project funds with accelerated implementation of all promised installations. Second, proper registration of all company intellectual property to Horizon itself, not to any individual or separate entity. Third, governance changes that ensure this situation cannot recur." "And Daniel's role?" Jason asked quietly. "That's for the board to determine," I replied. "But I cannot continue working with him directly, nor can I lend my name and reputation to a company he controls." Harold Parker scoffed. "So it is an ultimatum, him or you." "It's a recognition of reality," I corrected. "Daniel has demonstrated he's willing to prioritize personal enrichment over company mission, to manipulate financial reporting, and to divorce essential intellectual property from the company itself. Those actions make his continued leadership untenable if Horizon is to maintain credibility with investors, partners, and communities." The Apex representative spoke up from the video screen. "From our perspective, the intellectual property issue is paramount. Our investment thesis assumes Horizon owns its core technology outright. If that's not the case, we would need to reassess completely." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Indeed. Though Daniel's point raises serious concerns about Horizon's viability regardless of leadership changes." She turned to Mark Henderson. "What's our legal position regarding the patent ownership?" The company counsel consulted briefly with his junior attorneys before responding. "It's complicated. The patents were indeed registered to Mitchell Innovations rather than Horizon directly. However, all development work was conducted using company resources, by company employees, during company time. That creates a strong claim that the intellectual property rightfully belongs to Horizon despite the registration. Additionally," Olivia added, "we have documentation showing that Mitchell Innovations was established after Horizon began patent development specifically to receive those registrations. This suggests deliberate circumvention of standard corporate IP protocols." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "So we're looking at potential patent litigation on top of SEC investigation and financial remediation. Hardly the clean path to IPO we envisioned." For the next 2 hours, the discussion circled through various scenarios and potential resolutions. The board seemed genuinely torn, unwilling to simply surrender to Daniel's implied threat, but equally concerned about a protracted legal battle that could destroy Horizon's value entirely. Throughout, I maintained my position. Horizon's mission mattered more than any individual's control or enrichment. The technology we'd developed could genuinely improve lives if deployed as originally intended. That purpose was worth fighting for, even if the battle proved difficult. As the meeting finally adjourned with no firm resolution beyond scheduling further discussions, Eleanor asked me to remain behind. When we were alone except for Jason, she studied me with the shrewd assessment of someone who had navigated countless corporate conflicts. "You realize he won't surrender easily. she said without preamble. Daniel built his identity around Horizon's success. He'll fight with everything he has. I know, I replied quietly. I was married to him for 4 years. I've seen what he's capable of when challenged. She nodded slowly. And yet you proceeded anyway. Why? The question deserved honest reflection. Because some principles are worth defending, even at great personal cost. The communities we promised to serve matter. The employees who believed in our mission matter. The truth matters. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jason. Truth is expensive in corporate America, Mrs. Mitchell. Are you prepared for what this will cost you? I thought of our house, my possessions, my reputation in an industry where Daniel had extensive connections. Everything material that I valued was already at risk, but something more fundamental had been reclaimed: my integrity, my purpose, my voice. I think the more relevant question, I replied, gathering my documents, is whether Daniel is prepared for what his deception will cost him. As I left the Horizon offices that had been my professional home for years, employees watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. The receptionist, who had known me since our startup days, whispered, "Good luck," as I passed. In the elevator, a young engineer who had worked on our community installations gave me a subtle nod of support. Outside, Portland's familiar gray skies opened in a gentle rain that matched my contemplative mood. Whatever came next, legal battles, financial uncertainty, professional rebuilding, I had taken the first crucial step. I had refused to be temporary, refused to be discarded when convenient, refused to compromise on the principles that had drawn me to this work in the first place. Daniel had inadvertently given me the most valuable gift possible: the clarifying knowledge that I was nothing, like the calculating, expedient person he had revealed himself to be. Whatever happened with Horizon, that distinction would remain my permanent foundation moving forward. The days following the board meeting unfolded in a blur of legal consultations, depositions, and strategic planning sessions. I had temporarily relocated to Olivia's guest bedroom after attempting to retrieve personal items from my home, only to find the locks changed and a terse legal notice taped to the door warning against unauthorized entry. Daniel's message was clear. Everything we had shared was now a battlefield. "We've filed for an emergency hearing regarding your personal property," Olivia informed me over breakfast, scrolling through emails on her tablet. "But the judge assigned to the case is notoriously slow with domestic matters. It could be weeks before you gain access." I stirred my coffee absently, trying to prioritize what I needed most from the house: family photographs, irreplaceable mementos from my grandmother, the handcrafted quilt that had been a wedding gift from my former colleagues at the environmental nonprofit. The rest, clothes, books, furniture, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the larger conflict unfolding. "Any updates from Horizon?" I asked, redirecting my thoughts to more productive channels. Olivia set down her tablet. "Jason called last night while you were in the shower. The board has reached a tentative position. They're offering you a 6-month paid leave of absence, while they conduct a full investigation." Daniel would also be placed on leave, with separate independent leadership brought in temporarily. I considered this development. They're trying to remove both of us from the equation to stabilize the company. Essentially, yes. It's not unreasonable from their perspective. Horizon is hemorrhaging value while this plays out publicly. 3 major partners have already requested emergency meetings to reassess their relationships. The weight of unintended consequences pressed against my conscience. Horizon employed over 200 people whose livelihoods now hung in uncertainty because of my actions. The technology we'd developed could genuinely improve energy access for underserved communities. Had my pursuit of justice endangered something greater than my marriage? Olivia seemed to read my thoughts. "This isn't your fault, Rebecca. The responsibility lies with Daniel. He created this situation through his deception. You simply exposed it. And yet I'm the one who feels guilty about the potential fallout, I murmured, rising to rinse my coffee mug. I should accept the board's offer. A clean break would give Horizon its best chance to survive this. Before you make that decision, Olivia cautioned, there's something else you should know. A whistleblower has come forward from within Horizon, someone from the finance department. They've provided additional documentation showing that Daniel has been systematically moving company assets to personal accounts throughout the past month, ever since you confronted him about the community project funds. This new betrayal shouldn't have shocked me, yet somehow it did. Even as he'd stood in the boardroom talking about remediation and making amends, Daniel had been actively undermining the company's financial position. He's preparing for scorched earth, I realized. If he can't maintain control, he'll extract whatever value he can before everything collapses. It appears so, which means your accepting a leave of absence might actually facilitate his plans rather than stabilize the situation. I leaned against the kitchen counter, recalibrating my approach. We need to move more aggressively then. I want a full forensic audit of all Horizon accounts, and we should alert the board to this new development immediately. Olivia nodded, already drafting an email. Also, the SEC investigator has requested a preliminary interview tomorrow morning. They're particularly interested in the patent situation after receiving documentation from an anonymous source. Tara, I guessed. Daniel's executive assistant had been quietly supplying information since the initial confrontation, her loyalty to the company's mission apparently stronger than her fear of Daniel's retribution. The following morning, I met with a stern-faced SEC investigator named Carol Martinez in Olivia's conference room. She wasted no time on pleasantries, diving directly into a comprehensive review of Horizon's financial structures. To be clear, Mrs. Mitchell, when did you first become aware that the company's core patents were registered to Mitchell Innovations rather than to Horizon directly? I took a slow breath, knowing my answer would shape the investigation's direction. 3 weeks ago, when I began reviewing company documents more thoroughly, as co-founder, I had been involved in the technology development from the beginning, but Daniel handled most of the legal and financial aspects. Yet your signature appears on the initial patent applications, she noted, sliding a document across the table. Here, dated 3 years ago. I examined the paperwork, recognizing my signature but not the specific document. I signed numerous documents during Horizon's startup phase. Daniel would present paperwork requiring my signature as co-founder, but often characterized it as standard corporate formalities without detailed explanation. Convenient, Martinez observed neutrally. It was a marriage as well as a business. Partnership, I explained, feeling a flush of embarrassment at my naivete. I trusted him implicitly. Martinez made a notation in her file. And regarding the community project funds, approximately $30 million diverted to other purposes. When did you become aware of these discrepancies? I first noticed inconsistencies about a month ago when reviewing project implementation timelines. Communities were asking why promised installations hadn't begun, despite our financial statements indicating the projects were funded. When I investigated further, I found the actual deployments didn't match our public commitments. For the next 2 hours, Martinez methodically built a chronology of Horizon's financial operations, focusing particularly on decision points where funds had been redirected or misrepresented. Throughout, I maintained absolute honesty, including acknowledging when I should have exercised greater oversight as co-founder. As the interview concluded, Martinez fixed me with a penetrating stare. Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate your apparent candor today. However, I should note that whistleblower protections have limitations when the reporting party has benefited from the activities in question. Your lifestyle over the past 4 years was presumably supported by the same financial structures you're now reporting. The implication stung, though I recognized its legitimacy. I understand. I'm not claiming perfect innocence here. I should have asked more questions, should have maintained closer involvement with financial operations. My failure to do so doesn't change the underlying violations, but I accept responsibility for my insufficient oversight. Martinez seemed slightly surprised by this admission. That's refreshingly forthright. Most subjects in your position attempt to distance themselves entirely. I'm not interested in escaping responsibility, I replied. I'm interested in correcting a wrong that affects real people counting on our technology. The communities we promise to serve deserve better than broken commitments. After Martinez departed with a substantial collection of documents, Olivia looked cautiously optimistic. That went as well as could be expected. Your transparency will serve you better than attempted evasion. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason. Emergency board meeting called for 3 p.m. Daniel presented counter evidence. Board requesting your presence. I showed Olivia the message, a knot forming in my stomach. Counter evidence? What could he possibly have? We should prepare for anything, she advised. Daniels had time to construct alternative narratives, possibly manipulate documentation. Remember, he controlled most of the company's systems and records. 3 hours later, we entered Horizon's conference room to find a dramatically different atmosphere from our previous meeting. The board members appeared tense but energized, several leaning forward with the focused attention of people who believed they'd discovered something significant. Daniel sat at the head of the table, immaculately dressed and wearing an expression of wounded integrity that immediately triggered my suspicion. "Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Mitchell," Eleanor began, her tone notably cooler than during our last interaction. "Significant new information has come to light that requires immediate clarification." Daniel didn't look at me directly, maintaining the perfect posture of someone righteously aggrieved but taking the high road. I recognized the performance from countless social situations where he had charmed rooms full of people while privately harboring entirely different sentiments. "We've received documentation," Eleanor continued, "suggesting your characterization of events may have been incomplete. Specifically, evidence indicating you were not only aware of, but actively involved in structuring the separate entity for patent registration." Daniel's attorney, an impeccably groomed man I hadn't seen before, distributed folders to everyone present. These emails, dated 3 years ago, clearly show Mrs. Mitchell discussing the establishment of Mitchell Innovations as the appropriate vehicle for intellectual property ownership. I opened the folder to find what appeared to be email exchanges between Daniel and me, discussing patent strategy and language that suggested full knowledge and approval of the separate entity structure. The emails contained phrases and technical terminology I recognized, interwoven with statements I had never made. "These are fabricated," I stated immediately, looking up from the documents. "I never wrote these emails." Harold Parker scoffed audibly. "Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? When confronted with evidence contradicting your narrative, you simply claim forgery." "It's not a claim, it's a fact," I replied firmly. "I never participated in these exchanges. I never approved separating the patents from Horizon." "The metadata and server logs indicate otherwise," Daniel's attorney countered smoothly. "These communications came from your company account, from your computer, during normal business hours when you were demonstrably present in the office." I turned to Jason, who appeared troubled but not entirely convinced by either side. "Jason, you know these aren't authentic. These don't even sound like me." Before he could respond, Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice carrying just the right note of reluctant disappointment. "I didn't want to introduce this evidence, Rebecca. I hoped we could resolve our differences without further escalation. But your SEC filing forced my hand. The board deserves the complete picture." His performance was masterful, the reasonable husband reluctantly defending himself against an unstable, vindictive wife. I could see several board members softening toward him, their earlier skepticism giving way to doubt about my credibility. Olivia intervened smoothly. If I may, these purported emails contain several technological anachronisms that call their authenticity into serious question. She pointed to specific phrases in the documents. This refers to patent application P435, which, according to Horizon's own records, wasn't created until 6 months after these emails were supposedly exchanged. Daniel's attorney shrugged dismissively. Project code names often precede formal applications. That proves nothing. Additionally, Olivia continued undeterred, the email formatting is inconsistent with Horizon's server configuration from that period. We've subpoenaed the original server logs as part of our filing, which will definitively resolve the question of authenticity. A flicker of concern crossed Daniel's face before he masked it with renewed confidence. By all means, examine the logs. They'll simply confirm what these emails already demonstrate: that Rebecca was fully informed and actively participated in all company structuring decisions. I studied the documents more carefully, recognizing the sophisticated manipulation at work. Daniel had taken genuine emails I'd sent about other topics and edited them, inserting new content while maintaining enough of my authentic voice to make them seem plausible. Without forensic analysis, the average reader would find them convincing. There's also the matter of the community project funds, Eleanor noted, turning to another section in the folder. Mr. Mitchell has provided documentation showing the reallocation of those funds was approved in a formal executive session last year, with Mrs. Mitchell present. This was an even bolder fabrication, claiming an entire meeting that had never occurred. I was about to object when Jason cleared his throat. I have no record of that executive session, he stated carefully. As CFO, I should have been included in any discussion involving significant fund reallocation, particularly of that magnitude. Daniel smiled indulgently. You were traveling to the Seattle installation that week, Jason. We conducted the session via conference call with Rebecca and the project leads. The minutes were filed with the standard quarterly documentation. Jason frowned. I review all quarterly documentation. These minutes weren't included in any package I received. An administrative oversight, perhaps, Daniel suggested with calculated reasonableness. The timing coincided with Tara's maternity leave, if you recall. Several procedural gaps occurred during that transition period. The tactical brilliance of Daniel's approach became increasingly clear. He wasn't denying the financial irregularities or patent issues outright. That would be easily disproven. Instead, he was constructing an alternative narrative where these decisions had been proper, transparent, and collectively approved, but poorly documented due to administrative oversights. It was plausible enough to create reasonable doubt about my claims of deliberate misconduct. This is gaslighting on an institutional scale, I said finally, addressing the board directly. Daniel is attempting to rewrite history through fabricated documentation because he knows genuine records would confirm my account. Eleanor studied me with careful neutrality. These are serious allegations on both sides. The board is simply trying to establish facts before taking irrevocable action. Then let's establish facts properly, I proposed. A comprehensive forensic analysis of all company servers, conducted by an independent third party, would reveal whether these alleged emails and meeting minutes existed contemporaneously or were created recently. Daniel's attorney interjected smoothly. Such an investigation would be extraordinarily disruptive to ongoing operations and potentially damaging to proprietary information. Given that the SEC is already involved, adding another layer of investigation seems redundant and counterproductive. On the contrary, Olivia countered, a proper forensic analysis would provide clarity for all parties, including the SEC. If Mr. Mitchell is confident in his documentation, he should welcome independent verification. The subtle chess match continued for another hour. with Daniel presenting additional evidence of my supposed complicity, while Olivia methodically identified inconsistencies and anachronisms in each document. Throughout, I maintained composed defiance, refusing to be rattled by even the most convincing fabrications. As the meeting finally adjourned with the board promising to consider both perspectives before making further decisions, Jason approached me discreetly. "The community impact assessment reports," he murmured. "The original versions with your notes in the margins. Do you still have copies?" I nodded slightly, recalling the detailed project proposals I'd developed for underserved neighborhoods, with handwritten annotations about implementation timelines and funding requirements. "Those would conclusively prove your position on the community funds," he continued. "If you were advocating for accelerated deployment, while Daniel was secretly diverting the money." "I saved everything," I confirmed quietly. "Both digital and hard copies, stored off-site." A look of relief crossed his face. "Get them to Eleanor directly, not through the general board submission process. She's more objective than she appears. She just needs unambiguous evidence to counter Daniel's narrative." As we prepared to leave, Daniel intercepted me near the elevator, positioning himself to appear as though we were having a conciliatory conversation while keeping his back to the security cameras. "You're only hurting yourself, Rebecca," he said softly, his public smile contrasting with the coldness in his eyes. "Take the settlement offer. Walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere far from here. Because this path you've chosen ends with you discredited, unemployable, and alone." I met his gaze steadily. "You still don't understand, do you? This stopped being about us the moment I saw those diverted community funds. Those neighborhoods were counting on technology that would significantly reduce their energy costs. Technology we promised them. Real people with real needs who were used as marketing props while you redirected their allocated funds to offshore accounts." Something flickered in his expression. Not remorse, but perhaps surprise at my continued focus on the communities rather than our personal conflict. "Always the idealist," he murmured. The words an echo of how he'd once described me admiringly in the early days of our relationship. "But ideals don't win corporate wars, Rebecca. Experience, connections, and capital do. I have all three. What exactly do you have?" "Something you apparently never valued," I replied quietly. "Integrity." His smile tightened imperceptibly. "Let's see what the market value of integrity is when you're filing for bankruptcy. I've instructed my attorneys to contest every penny of our marital assets. Nothing will be settled for years." The elevator arrived and I stepped inside, turning to face him as the doors began to close. "You know what's interesting, Daniel? When you described me as your temporary wife, you never considered that I might be the one to decide when the arrangement ended." The doors closed on his momentarily startled expression, giving me the small satisfaction of having scored the final point in this particular exchange. Later that evening, as Olivia and I sorted through the community project documentation to deliver to Eleanor, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, I answered. "Rebecca Mitchell?" a woman's voice inquired. "This is Diane Foster from Portland Community Energy Initiative. We met last year during your presentation about neighborhood solar installations." I remembered her immediately, a passionate community organizer who had been cautiously optimistic about Horizon's promises to her historically underserved neighborhood. "Of course, Ms. Foster. How can I help you?" "I'll be direct. We've been reading about the situation at Horizon. Our neighborhood coalition has spent 18 months planning around technology that was promised to reduce energy costs for over 300 families. Now we're hearing rumors that the project may never happen." The weight of real-world impact settled heavily on my shoulders. "The situation is complicated, but I want you to know I'm fighting to ensure those commitments are honored." "That's why I'm calling," she replied. "Our coalition represents 12 neighborhoods across Portland that were included in Horizon's community initiative. Together, that's nearly 4,000 families, We want to know if there's anything we can do to support your efforts to hold the company accountable." Her offer caught me by surprise. Throughout the legal maneuvering and corporate politics, I had been thinking of the affected communities as distant beneficiaries rather than potential allies. "Actually," I said slowly, an idea forming, "there might be. How would you feel about attending the next board meeting as community stakeholders, putting faces to the promises Horizon made?" "We can do better than that," Diane responded with growing enthusiasm. "We can organize a community forum and invite the board, investors, and media to hear directly from the families who would be impacted by this technology. Make it impossible to dismiss these projects as just numbers on a spreadsheet." By the time we ended the call an hour later, the outline of a powerful counteroffensive had emerged. While Daniel fought through fabricated documents and legal maneuvering, I would bring the actual communities into the conversation, creating public accountability that corporate boardrooms couldn't easily dismiss. As I shared the plan with Olivia, her initial legal caution gave way to strategic appreciation. "It's unorthodox, but potentially brilliant. Daniel has been treating this as a corporate governance issue. Manageable through traditional channels, he understands how to manipulate. Bringing in community stakeholders changes the dynamic entirely. It also refocuses the conversation on what actually matters," I noted. "Not who controls Horizon or who wins the corporate battle, but whether we honor commitments to communities who are counting on us." For the first time since overhearing Daniel's devastating conversation with his mother, I felt genuine optimism about the path forward. My husband had dismissed me as temporary, disposable once I had served my purpose in building Horizon's image. Now I would demonstrate exactly what that aesthetic he had so casually disparaged, authentic commitment to community impact, actually meant in practice. The temporary wife was proving surprisingly permanent, and the reckoning had only just begun. The Portland Community Center buzzed with energy as residents from 12 neighborhoods filled every available seat. Handmade signs dotted the audience. "Horizon promised, we're still waiting," and "Clean energy is not a marketing prop." Local news cameras lined the back wall, their presence ensuring this gathering would reach far beyond these walls. I stood, slightly apart, watching as Diane Foster confirmed final sound system details while community representatives organized their presentations. "Impressive turnout," Jason observed, joining me at the edge of the room. "Half the board is here already, plus 3 representatives from Apex. Daniel is noticeably absent." "He won't engage directly with the communities," I replied. "That would require acknowledging them as real people rather than convenient marketing." Narratives. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation for this forum. While Daniel had continued his campaign of documentation manipulation and legal maneuvering, I had focused on building a different kind of leverage, the power of public accountability through the voices of those most affected by Horizon's broken promises. Eleanor Winters arrived, surveying the packed community center with poorly concealed surprise. She made her way toward us, elegant as always in a tailored suit that likely cost more than most attendees earned in a month. "This is quite the gathering, Mrs. Mitchell," she remarked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp with assessment. "I trust it will remain constructive rather than confrontational?" "These communities aren't interested in corporate drama, Ms. Winters. They simply want answers about technology they were promised. Technology that would significantly reduce their energy costs and that many have already made financial plans around." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough, though I wonder if a public forum is the most effective venue for such discussions. Previous attempts at private resolution have been undermined by fabricated evidence and legal obstruction," I replied evenly. "Perhaps transparency will prove more productive." As more board members filtered in, taking seats in the front row, Diane approached the microphone. The room quieted immediately. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone long accustomed to community organizing. 18 months ago, Horizon Innovations presented plans for sustainable energy installations in 12 Portland neighborhoods historically underserved by traditional utility companies. We were promised technology that would reduce monthly energy costs by up to 60% for nearly 4,000 families. She gestured to large timeline displays positioned around the room, showing Horizon's original implementation schedule alongside the current status, all projects months behind with no visible progress. Today, we seek answers, Diane continued. Not accusations, not corporate politics, just straightforward information about whether these promises will be kept, and if so, when. For the next hour, representatives from each neighborhood presented their stories. A retired teacher explained how her fixed income made traditional energy costs increasingly difficult to manage, and how Horizon's promised technology had factored into her financial planning. A young father described the community center that had postponed critical repairs because their budget assumed energy savings from Horizon's installations. A nurse from the East Side neighborhood detailed how reduced energy costs would allow the local clinic to expand service hours. Throughout these testimonials, I watched the board members' expressions shift from polite professional interest to genuine discomfort. These weren't abstract financial allocations or project codes on spreadsheets. They were real people whose lives were directly impacted by decisions made in corporate boardrooms. When the community presentations concluded, Diane invited Horizon representatives to respond. Eleanor, as board chair, approached the microphone with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to difficult public situations. First, let me thank everyone for sharing your experiences today, she began diplomatically. Horizon remains committed to our community initiatives, though admittedly, implementation has experienced delays beyond our original projections. The board is currently conducting a comprehensive review of all project timelines and funding allocations to ensure we can deliver on our commitments. With all due respect, interjected a community organizer from the historically Black neighborhood, in North Portland, we've heard that explanation for months. Meanwhile, we've seen Horizon announcing new commercial partnerships and preparing for an IPO. Are we supposed to believe our projects are still priorities when they haven't progressed? While corporate growth continues. Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor, though I noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. I understand your frustration. Without going into confidential corporate matters, I can assure you that the board is actively investigating allocation of resources across all projects, including these community initiatives. Investigating is not implementing, Diane responded firmly. Our communities need specific commitments, not more corporate review processes. As Eleanor searched for an appropriate response, Jason stepped forward unexpectedly. If I may, he said, taking the microphone. As Horizon's CFO, I can confirm that full funding for all 12 community projects was originally allocated and approved. That funding, approximately $30 million, was subsequently redirected to other purposes without proper authorization or transparency. He paused, glancing at the board members whose expressions ranged from shock at his directness to resignation that this information was now public. The board is currently working to determine how and when those funds can be restored to their intended purpose. A murmur ran through the audience as the implications of Jason's statement registered. He had effectively confirmed that community project funds had been misappropriated, something Horizon had thus far avoided acknowledging publicly. Eleanor quickly reclaimed the microphone, damage control evident in her tight smile. As Mr. Reynolds indicated, we're investigating certain financial irregularities that may have affected project timelines. I want to assure everyone that addressing these community commitments remains a priority for Horizon. When? Called out one resident. We need specific dates, not vague assurances. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes, with board members offering increasingly strained responses as community members pressed for concrete information. The presence of news cameras ensured every exchange was recorded for broader distribution, creating exactly the public accountability I had hoped for when helping organize this forum. As the event concluded, Diane delivered a clear ultimatum. The community coalition expected a detailed implementation plan with firm timelines within 2 weeks, or they would pursue more aggressive options, including potential legal action for misrepresentation and breach of contract. Outside the community center, Eleanor approached me with barely contained fury beneath her professional veneer. "That was an ambush, Mrs. Mitchell," she said quietly. "Using these communities as leverage in your dispute with Daniel crosses a line." "These communities aren't leverage," I replied evenly. "They're stakeholders who deserve honesty about promises made in Horizon's name. If that creates discomfort for the board, perhaps that discomfort should be directed toward those who diverted their allocated funds." Eleanor studied me with new assessment. "You're more strategic than we initially gave you credit for. This public forum effectively prevents the board from containing this situation quietly. Transparency tends to have that effect." Her expression shifted slightly, a reluctant respect emerging. "The board meets tomorrow morning to review all aspects of this situation. Your presence would be welcomed, as would any documentation supporting your position regarding the community project funds." Before I could respond, a commotion near the parking area caught our attention. Daniel had arrived, apparently having reconsidered his absence once local news coverage began streaming the event live. He was surrounded by reporters, offering smooth reassurances about Horizon's continued commitment to community projects. "Temporary. Delays due to technical refinements," he explained with practiced sincerity, his charming smile firmly in place. "We're actually enhancing the technology to provide even greater efficiency before deployment. These communities deserve our absolute best, not rushed implementation." The performance was masterful. Concerned executive focused on quality rather than expediency, presented with such conviction that even I might have believed him if I hadn't seen the financial records showing where the money had actually gone. "He's still trying to control the narrative," Jason murmured, joining us as we watched Daniel's impromptu press conference. "Let him try," I replied with unexpected calmness. "The communities have spoken for themselves today. Their voices will resonate more powerfully than his corporate spin." Eleanor excused herself to manage Daniel's unexpected appearance, leaving Jason and me to observe from a distance. "That was quite a statement you made in there," I noted. "Publicly confirming the fund diversion puts you at risk professionally." Jason shrugged slightly. "After seeing those community presentations, continuing to obfuscate seemed unconscionable. These are real people whose lives would meaningfully improve with technology we've already developed and had funded. The corporate games Daniel's playing, that we've all been complicit in, suddenly seemed indefensible." His admission of partial complicity reflected my own journey, the gradual awakening to how I had accepted certain compromises in Horizon's operations because they came wrapped in Daniel's persuasive rationalizations about necessary business pragmatism. "The board meeting tomorrow will be decisive," Jason continued. "Daniel's been lobbying members individually, offering various narratives that minimize his culpability while suggesting your motivations are primarily personal rather than ethical. And what do they believe? They're business people, Rebecca. They believe in whatever resolution protects Horizon's valuation and their investment." He hesitated, though today's community forum has complicated that calculation significantly. Public accountability is harder to navigate than private settlement. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Daniel had spotted us. He excused himself from the reporters and began walking in our direction, his expression shifting from public charm to something harder as he approached. "Quite the spectacle you've orchestrated," he remarked, keeping his voice low despite the coldness in his eyes. "Using disadvantaged communities as props in your vendetta, and they call me manipulative. These communities were always more than props to me, Daniel. That's something you never understood." His smile was tight, calculated. "The difference between us is that I understand business realities. Those solar installations you're championing, the economics never made sense. The technology is too expensive for the limited return in these neighborhoods. It was always primarily a marketing initiative to attract mainstream commercial clients. Good PR that demonstrated our social values. The casual cynicism of his statement stunned me despite everything I had already learned about his true character. You actually believe that, don't you? That these thousands of families were just convenient marketing collateral for your real business targets. I believe in building a company that creates genuine value, he countered. Sentimental projects that drain resources without generating sufficient return ultimately help no one. If Horizon fails because of misallocated capital, those communities get nothing anyway. Jason shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly recognizing the fundamental philosophical divide that had quietly undermined Horizon from within, the tension between authentic mission and pragmatic business priorities, between community impact and shareholder value. You presented Horizon as a different kind of company, I reminded him. One that measured success by more than just financial metrics. Was that always a lie? Daniel sighed with exaggerated patience. It was aspirational marketing, Rebecca, necessary positioning for a startup in the sustainability space. Once we achieve sufficient scale and stability, social impact initiatives become more viable. That's how business works. And yet you found plenty of resources for the vacation property in Maui and the offshore accounts, I noted quietly. Those weren't deferred for future consideration once the company achieved sufficient scale. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes before he restored his mask of reasonable explanation. Executive retention matters. Building a successful company requires attracting and keeping top talent. The board understood that, even if you couldn't grasp the nuances of strategic compensation. Before I could respond, Olivia emerged from the community center and quickly assessed the situation. Rebecca, we should leave. The community representatives are requesting a follow-up meeting to discuss next steps. Daniel's smile turned knowing. By all means, continue your community organizing. I'll focus on saving the company you're determined to destroy through misguided idealism. As we walked away, Olivia muttered, "That man has an extraordinary capacity for self-justification." It's his superpower, I agreed. He genuinely believes his own narratives, which makes him incredibly persuasive to others. Which is why tomorrow's board meeting is so crucial, she replied. We need to bring overwhelming evidence, not just compelling emotions. Throughout the evening, we prepared meticulously for the board presentation. Olivia assembled a comprehensive legal brief addressing the patent ownership issues, while I organized documentation showing the original community project allocations alongside evidence of fund diversions. Jason contributed internal financial records that conclusively demonstrated how and when money had been moved from approved project budgets to various shell entities. This should be sufficient to counter whatever narrative Daniel has constructed, Olivia concluded as we finalized our presentation materials. Though I'm still concerned about his influence with certain board members. We have something more powerful than influence, I replied, reviewing footage from the day's community forum that had already begun circulating online. We have public accountability and moral clarity. After today, the board can't simply make this disappear through private settlement. Morning brought news that sharply intensified the stakes. Daniel had filed emergency legal motions seeking to remove me from any position of authority within Horizon, citing substantial evidence of corporate sabotage motivated by personal animus. His filings included the fabricated emails and meeting minutes, presented as definitive proof that I had been fully aware of all financial and patent decisions, but had chosen to weaponize them during our marital dispute. More alarmingly, he had secured a temporary freezing order on all personal accounts bearing my name, effectively cutting off access to any remaining financial resources. The legal reasoning, that I might use personal funds to further damage Horizon's interests, was flimsy, but sufficient to create immediate practical hardship. "This is a pressure tactic," Olivia assured me as we drove to Horizon headquarters, "designed to force you into settlement before the board can fully evaluate the evidence. It actually suggests he's worried about today's meeting." I nodded, trying to focus on the larger principles at stake rather than the immediate financial stress. "He's always believed everyone has a price, a point at which principles give way to pragmatism. He's trying to find mine." The boardroom was tense when we arrived, conversations halting abruptly as we entered. Daniel was already present, seated confidently beside Eleanor with a substantial binder of materials open before him. His legal team, now expanded to 3 attorneys, occupied positions along the wall, while the board members arranged themselves with visible discomfort around the massive oak table. "Mrs. Mitchell," Eleanor began formally, "the board appreciates your attendance given the complicated circumstances. We've allocated the morning to review all perspectives on the matters at hand, beginning with financial oversight concerns and proceeding to the patent ownership questions." Daniel offered me a bland smile that conveyed absolute certainty in his position. He had clearly spent considerable time reinforcing his narrative with key board members before this formal session. For the next 2 hours, presentations and counter-presentations unfolded in excruciating detail. Daniel's team presented elaborately constructed timelines suggesting all financial decisions had been properly approved through governance channels, with any irregularities attributed to administrative oversights during rapid company growth. My documentation directly contradicted these claims, showing specific instances where funds designated for community projects had been systematically diverted to entities controlled personally by Daniel. As morning stretched into afternoon, the i.e. patent ownership dispute took center stage. Daniel's attorneys presented the separate entity structure as standard practice for protecting intellectual property during a company's vulnerable early stages, with full intention to transfer ownership to Horizon before the IPO. They produced complex legal documents supposedly establishing this arrangement, though many contained inconsistencies when examined closely. "The fundamental question," Olivia summarized during her rebuttal, "is whether company resources were used to develop technology that was then registered to a private entity without proper disclosure or compensation to the company itself. The evidence clearly indicates this occurred, regardless of any supposed future intentions to rectify the situation." Throughout these presentations, I observed the board members carefully. Harold Parker remained steadfastly aligned with Daniel, dismissing even the most compelling evidence as circumstantial or misinterpreted. 3 other members seemed genuinely troubled by the accumulating documentation of misconduct, while the remaining 3, including Eleanor, maintained carefully neutral expressions that revealed little about their evolving perspectives. As the formal presentations concluded, Eleanor called for a 30-minute recess before the board would deliberate. In the hallway outside the conference room, Jason approached with a troubled expression. "Daniel's making his move," he murmured, leading me to a quiet corner. "He's offering to resign voluntarily with a substantial exit package if the board agrees to 3 conditions. No further investigation into financial matters, full control of the Mitchell Innovations patents through a permanent licensing arrangement, and your immediate removal from any position within Horizon." The calculated ruthlessness of this proposal was quintessential Daniel, sacrificing his formal position while maintaining actual control of the company's most valuable assets and eliminating me entirely from the equation. He's offering to fall on his sword without actually suffering any consequences, I observed, while ensuring I take the blame publicly. Essentially, yes, and several board members seem receptive. They're focused on stabilizing the company quickly to preserve the IPO timeline, even at the cost of real accountability. I considered this development carefully. "What about the community projects?" Jason sighed. His proposal includes a recommitment to community initiatives once the company stabilizes post-IPO. No specific timelines or guarantees. So nothing changes for the communities, while Daniel walks away with the patents and a golden parachute. The injustice burned, Yet I recognized the corporate pragmatism that made such a resolution appealing to board members primarily concerned with their investment returns. The board reconvenes in 15 minutes to consider all options, Jason noted. If you have a counter-proposal, now's the time. I did have one final card to play, something I had considered but hesitated to use until absolutely necessary. The moment had arrived. When the board meeting resumed, Eleanor outlined Daniel's voluntary resignation offer with diplomatic neutrality, though I detected a subtle bias toward acceptance in her phrasing. The relief among certain board members was palpable, a path toward resolution that would avoid protracted public conflict while preserving Horizon's essential value proposition for the impending IPO. Before the board votes on this proposal, I interjected, I'd like to present one additional document that significantly impacts this decision. I distributed copies of a legal filing I had prepared with Olivia but not yet submitted. A formal whistleblower complaint to the Department of Justice regarding potential violations of securities law, environmental regulations, and financial disclosure requirements. The complaint detailed not just Daniel's actions, but the potential complicity of board members who had approved questionable allocations without proper oversight. This filing has not yet been submitted, I explained as alarmed expressions spread around the table. Its submission would depend entirely on whether Horizon demonstrates genuine commitment to rectifying the issues we've identified today. Harold Parker erupted immediately. This is blackmail. You're threatening the entire board to get your way. This is accountability, I corrected calmly. Each of you has fiduciary responsibilities that extend beyond facilitating a convenient resolution. If those responsibilities have been neglected, there are consequences beyond merely negotiating Daniel's exit terms. Eleanor studied the document with focused attention, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. What exactly are you proposing as an alternative resolution, Mrs. Mitchell? I laid out my counteroffer clearly. Daniel's resignation without the golden parachute, immediate transfer of all patents from Mitchell Innovations to Horizon, full remediation of diverted community project funds with accelerated implementation timelines, and independent board oversight of all executive decisions, until new leadership was properly established. Additionally, I concluded, I am prepared to resign as well, eliminating any concern that this dispute is about personal control. My only conditions are that the community projects proceed as originally promised, and that Horizon's future leadership remain committed to the authentic mission that inspired its founding. The silence that followed was profound. Daniel stared at me with cold fury, recognizing that I had effectively countered his attempt to emerge unscathed. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly reassessing their positions in light of the potential legal exposure outlined in my unfiled complaint. The board needs to deliberate privately, Eleanor announced, her professional composure firmly intact despite the heightened tensions. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Mitchell, please allow us 1 hour to consider these competing proposals. As we filed out of the conference room, Daniel caught up to me in the corridor, his voice low and intense. You would really risk destroying everything we built? Triggering investigations that could take years and ultimately benefit no one? I met his gaze steadily. I'm simply insisting on truth and accountability, something you once claimed to value, at least publicly. His expression hardened. This self-righteous crusade won't bring you happiness, Rebecca. When the dust settles, you'll have nothing. No husband, no company, no victory worth the cost. You still don't understand, I replied, feeling a curious mix of sadness and clarity. This stopped being about personal happiness the moment I realized what you'd done with those community project funds. Some principles actually matter more than individual comfort or victory. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across his face, the genuine bewilderment of someone encountering a value system so different from his own that it seemed incomprehensible. Then his mask of calculated control returned. The board will Choose pragmatism over principle, he stated with practiced confidence. They always do. The hour of deliberation stretched to nearly 3 as the board wrestled with their decision. When we were finally summoned back, the atmosphere in the conference room had shifted noticeably. Eleanor's expression was resolute rather than diplomatic, while several board members appeared to have reached reluctant but definitive conclusions. After extensive consideration, Eleanor began formally, the board has reached the following decisions. Mr. Mitchell's resignation is accepted, effective immediately. All patents registered to Mitchell Innovations will be transferred to Horizon ownership within 30 days. Community project funding will be fully restored with implementation, to begin within 60 days. Daniel's face remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in his jaw, the tell I had learned to recognize when he was suppressing genuine fury. Eleanor continued, Mrs. Mitchell, your offer to resign is acknowledged but not accepted at this time. The board requests you remain in a consulting capacity during the leadership transition, particularly to help restore community relationships and project implementation. This unexpected development clearly infuriated Daniel further, though he maintained rigid self-control as Eleanor outlined additional governance changes, including enhanced board oversight of all financial decisions and accelerated vetting of CEO candidates with strong ethical track records. When the formal announcements concluded, Daniel departed immediately, surrounded by his legal team already strategizing their next moves. I remained behind as board members filtered out, until only Eleanor and I were left in the conference room. Your unfiled whistleblower complaint was remarkably persuasive, she observed, gathering her materials. Though I suspect you never actually intended to submit it. I smiled slightly. It represented a path I was prepared to take if necessary, though not one I preferred. She studied me with newfound respect. When Daniel first brought you into Horizon's orbit, many of us assumed you were exactly what he presented, window dressing for the company's ethical image, a convenient partner who added authenticity to his ambition. I see now that assessment was not merely unfair but fundamentally backward. We often see what we expect to see, I replied, thinking of how long I had failed to recognize Daniel's true character despite mounting evidence. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. The board's decision wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Several members recognized that your commitment to Horizon's original mission represents its true value proposition, not just an idealistic distraction from business fundamentals. As we walked out together, she added, the search committee would welcome your input on leadership candidates who could authentically carry forward that mission. Later that evening, as news of Daniel's resignation spread through industry publications and local media, I sat in Olivia's living room watching the community project timelines being re-established. The implementation teams, many of whom had privately supported my position throughout the conflict, were already mobilizing resources for the long-delayed neighborhood installations. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane Foster. Channel 6 just reported full funding restored for all projects. Is it true? I confirmed that implementation would begin within 60 days, feeling a profound satisfaction that transcended any personal victory over Daniel. The neighborhoods would receive the technology they had been promised, reducing energy costs for thousands of families who genuinely needed that financial relief. Olivia joined me on the couch, reviewing legal documents for the formal separation of my marriage, a process that would undoubtedly prove contentious given Daniel's vindictive nature. The house remains contested, she noted, but we've secured an order allowing you to retrieve personal possessions this weekend. I nodded, realizing how little the material trappings of our marriage mattered compared to the principles at stake. The home I had once cherished now seemed like merely the elaborate setting for a performance that had never been authentic. What will you do next? Olivia asked, setting aside the legal paperwork. After the transition period at Horizon? I considered the question carefully. Throughout the conflict, I had been so focused on exposing Daniel's deception and protecting Horizon's mission that I had given little thought to my own future beyond this immediate battle. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. But I know it will involve continuing the work that actually matters, helping communities access sustainable technology that improves lives tangibly, not just aspirationally. My phone buzzed again. Jason, sharing a photo from the first neighborhood meeting where implementation teams were presenting the revised installation schedule. The expressions of cautious hope on residents' faces provided more satisfaction than any corporate victory could have offered. Daniel had deemed me a temporary wife, useful primarily for the authentic commitment I brought to Horizon's public image. He had calculated that I could be discarded when convenient, replaced by someone more aligned with his actual values once the company achieved sufficient success. What he had never understood, what his fundamental cynicism prevented him from grasping, was that the authenticity he had exploited as marketing represented genuine principle that couldn't be compromised for convenience or personal gain. The communities we had promised to serve mattered. The mission we had claimed to champion mattered. Truth and accountability mattered. As I reviewed the implementation schedules for solar installations that would meaningfully reduce energy costs for thousands of families, I recognized that the woman Daniel had dismissed as temporary had created something permanent, a recommitment to values that would outlast both our marriage and his leadership. Whatever came next, that legacy would endure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.